I feel like I've been on pause this week. Those of you that were here last week saw this image right at the end of the talk last week, and there was a little bit of confusion in my mind when I was talking about it, and so I'm hitting the reset and rewind, reset, start over again. So this is a work by Homer that falls into that kind of general category of Darwinian thinking that began to permeate in the later 19th century, although it wasn't expressed as directly as that, but it was more something that filtered down, the kind of survival of the fit. And it's also something that very much characterizes Remington's work, which we'll talk about today, or we'll see examples of. But I was showing this work, and I had come across a contemporary description of it. It was actually in the book that was the first biography of Winslow Homer, written by someone who knew him well. And it includes a lot of direct quotations from Homer. But the author, William Downes, writes about this work in particular. He says, the canvas exemplifies the originality of the artist's observation. He emphasizes its originality and his extraordinary instinct for a fine composition. And my point was that, in fact, the originality lies in part with him looking at Remington's work, which you see in the smaller image on the left. Remington's work of 1889 appeared in a book about hunting and fishing, whereas it was called Fishing and Shooting. And it's been pointed out before that there's a strong connection between the geese that are lying on the ground in both compositions, and very likely Homer did know this work. And I brought it in part just to indicate that these are two artists that in some ways have a lot of overlapping interests, certainly. They're both fishermen, although Remington was probably more of a hunter than a fisherman, and just the corollary with Homer. They also both were illustrators of great significance, and they knew each other's work. And I think that comes through in this particular image. Today the focus is on Frederic Remington, but a little bit different look at Remington. We think of him in the Dash for Timber, that great painting here, and other scenes of the West. In fact, he also did a number of scenes that aren't of the West. It's tempting to call them non-Western art, but that might conjure up images of Asian sculpture. So we'll just say the North Country, which is the area that he grew up in upstate New York. It is a land that is very much just adjacent to what is now the Adirondack Park. The Adirondack Mountains are there. He grew up in a little town called Canton, which is about 20 miles east of the St. Lawrence River. And then he lived in Ogdenburg, which is right on the St. Lawrence River in Canada. That's the boundary between the US and Canada. And so a lot of his work actually it depicts scenes or events or experiences he had in Canada. This is one example, Evening on a Canadian Lake from 1905. He was a great outdoorsman. He really was well regarded as an outdoorsman. He was a canoeist. He loved canoeing. In fact, as he unfortunately gained more and more weight, as he said, as he reached elephantine bulk, he had to give up riding. He had to give horse riding. He had to give up bike riding, but he could still float in a canoe. And he talked about what great exercise it was. And we'll look at a number of images of canoes, which is intriguing, I think, in many ways. But what's sort of nice for me, when I was pulling in the parking lot to come here just an hour or so ago, I saw this van with a canoe. I don't know if this belongs to anyone in this room. And Emily Sullivan was nice enough to walk me through how to share a photograph from my phone. And I could say I had a body cam on at the time, but I didn't. But I was really struck by this for a number of reasons. One, I've been looking at a lot of canoe images this last week, so it was really appropriate. The other was I thought this person knows something about the weather that maybe we all should know. Or this person is really into Remington and the North Country. So whoever it is, I'm glad if you're here, welcome. So having all said that, I wanted to go back to how we think of Remington really associated with the West. An image like this from the Amon Carter collection showing an Indian trapper, which is actually a trapper in Canada, but the northwest part of Canada. He had gone there in 1887, actually. He had persuaded the editors at Harper's Weekly to send him on a sketching trip to the Canadian West. And while there, he did a number of sketches and also enough drawings that he did a series of full-page drawings for Harper's Weekly for the next 6 months. And so it was a very fruitful trip. And this is one of the works that came out of that trip. But again, it's an image that, while not a cowboy, but it's showing an indigenous person in the West is the sort of image we associate with Remington. In this case, the trapper wearing what's recognizable as a Hudson Bay Company, what's called a blanket coat. In fact, we'll see it show up in another work. As typical of Remington's work, there's usually a high degree of accuracy, both in the costume that someone wears. This person has been identified as being a Blackfoot of the Blackfoot Nation, sometimes a Cree, but a Blackfoot usually, showing the kind of hat that trappers would have worn at the time, and all the accoutrements that he had is really typical of it. But this wonderful image of him turning, it's one of literally the more engaging images that Remington has, where someone, it's almost like it's a portrait. It wouldn't be surprising if the title was Portrait of So-and-so, seeming to look back from the trail directly at us and engage us. In a way, it's sort of like Dash for Timber, the horse is coming at us. We're automatically in the painting that way. In this case, there's a kind of contact between gazes, between our looking at this person looking at us. But as I say, it's also a work that is part of this traveling to Canada that Remington will do throughout his career. Again, he grows up in upstate New York, and so Canada is, literally a canoe paddle across the river. It's somewhere he was very familiar, and he did a lot of hunting there as well as in throughout the United States. The image on the right-hand side is showing trappers in this case in a Indian type canoe, a birch wood canoe, on this extraordinary mirror-like image, the sense of quietness about it. He painted this in a studio in upstate New York. Most of Remington's paintings were done in New York, not in the West, not actually in the West. This also, the canoe's been identified by a maker who lived in his hometown of Canton, and we know Remington had a canoe very similar to this himself. This, on the right, appeared as a double-page spread in Collier's magazine in 1905. Collier's was a popular, widely circulated United States publication. They had contracted with Remington in 1903 to reproduce his paintings. They bought the right to do that. He kept the paintings. They were his to sell or keep as he wanted, but they paid him royalties for the right to reproduce them. And they reproduced them in double-page spreads, which are, they're really, if you come across an actual Collier's magazine, the library here has them, they're really quite wonderful chromographic images. The work on the left was also illustrated, as I mentioned, in Harper's, it actually was in Harper's New Monthly. I mentioned Harper's Weekly. Harper's published a slightly more upscale journal called Harper's New Monthly Magazine, with longer articles and but with lots of illustrations. And this was in an article that was called American Writers, Some American Writers. And it was a two-part article, and the first part was really about the indigenous people and their connection to horses and the various ways they were used. So both of these are Canadian scenes, both of them illustrated, like so much of Remington's work, and one of the ways that he became so well known. It was interesting to me, I remember seeing this book when it appeared in 1983. I had just learned to read, and it was striking because I actually, as a child, grew up in a room, a bedroom, that had 4 Remington reproductions on the walls. And one of them, the cowpuncher, that's here in the collection. So I was very much familiar with Remington and liked Remington. And when I saw this book, which is about masterpieces of American painting, I thought, that's a weird painting to put on the cover. It's a Canadian scene, first of all. But it was also very striking and in a way very smart. This was an exhibition that was organized by the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. It traveled to the then Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C., and then on to the Grand Palais in Paris. So the really focus was to show Europeans about American art, and using this to show North America broadly defined, but also a different angle, and that was part of this interest in this catalog, was to present a slightly different angle on American art. An image which is in black and white. Many, certainly not all, but many of Remington's illustrations or they're paintings, they're oil paintings typically on canvas that he created for illustrations. And they've been collected as paintings, but typically they're black and white compositions because they're being translated into black and white prints. And so this is how the painting actually looks. It's sort of the typical style or size he uses. It's 16 by 20 inches, so a little over a foot, a little less than 2 feet in size. Really similar in size to the Homer composition, which is virtually the same dimensions, actually, but a watercolor that you see there. And again, bring the two together just to reemphasize the kind of connections that these two individuals had in terms of their interest in the outdoors, in terms of what they were representing, that they were illustrators as well as exhibiting artists. The scene on the left, entitled Blackwater, and it really has that wonderfully inky quality in this black and white image, also appeared, I shouldn't say also, did appear as an illustration in Harper's New Monthly Magazine in an article that Remington wrote. A lot of people forget or don't know that Remington was a prolific author as well. He wrote over 100 articles and stories. He published books. He turned one of his books into a play. It opened on Broadway, and it closed pretty much as soon as it opened. It didn't last very long. John Erman, Yellowstone, how could it not last? But apparently it was not successful. This is 1904, I think. But he was really widely respected as a writer. He wrote about his trips outdoors. He wrote fiction, and really quite remarkable. And he was a very energetic person, we might say. There are 3,000 paintings that are attributed to him, paintings and drawings, 22 bronzes that he created, and he was hunting and fishing and canoeing all the while. He had very little formal art education, again, not unlike Homer. In Remington's case, he was at Yale to play football and to do art for a year and a half, and then he left. He lived in the West. He had a sheep ranch for a while. He began illustration as a career in the mid-1880s, 1886, and became, by the mid-90s, hugely popular and successful and well-known as a illustrator. In 1899, we'll get to it in a minute, but he purchased an island in the St. Lawrence River where he built a house, and also he had a studio there as well. The part of the St. Lawrence where his house was and where he grew up in Ogdensburg, it's called the Thousand Islands. There are all these, it's dotted with lots of these small islands. Another one of his illustrations, this is sort of nice because you can see it's not entirely black and white. It has some kind of hints of tannish color in it. This is a work that is titled in a Stiff Current. As I said, this was a story, illustrated story by a friend of his. They were on a trip together, and that was often the case. He would partner with another writer, and he would do the illustrations. I wanted to read you a passage from the article that he wrote on the left for this, that this painting was included. The article was called Blackwater and Shallows, and it was about this difficult trip that he and Remington and a guide took on a river in upstate New York. But this sort of relates to a passage. He writes, "The quietness of the woods, with all their solemnity, permitting no bright or overdressed plant to obtrude itself, is rudely shocked by the garish painted thing as the yellow polished Neokuchu, as that was the name of his canoe, glides among them. The water rat dives with a tremendous splash as he sees this big black monster glide by its sedge." So he's talking about his own boat, which would be yellow in coloration. He also has a wonderful line in there after a couple of very, sort of bucolic, idyllic accounts of the environment. He writes, "Mosquitoes, those desperate little villains who dispute your happiness in the woods." So he acknowledges, and in fact, a lot of his writing is about the difficulty, which for him was part of the fun. I've used the term before, and you've seen it in connection with the exhibition upstairs, true sportsman, the sort of gentleman hunter. He did not consider himself a true sportsman. He considered himself a real sportsman. And he meant, as he said in describing others, a rough individual, a man with the bark on. He did lead a very rugged life when he was out of doors. He was not someone who took it easy. He purposely led what Teddy Roosevelt, who was a friend of his, called and advocated the strenuous life, to get away from the desk, to get outdoors, and to do manly things. Remington, also in the same article, he describes when they get into rapids, and he says, when he, meaning a real sportsman, is going faster into the boil of the waters, he hears the roar and boom ahead, and the black rocks crop up in thickening masses to dispute his way. He's fighting a game battle with the elements, and they are remorseless. Very Darwinian. He may break his leg or lose his life in the tip-over, which is imminent, but the fool is happy. Let him die. So you can tell he likes being outdoors, and he likes these challenges. The work on the right was written from an article written by became a good friend of his, Julian Ralph, and they traveled together a few times. This was an article about the Hudson Bay Company, that old trading company that had been around for a very long time in Canada, he was writing sort of a history, and then Remington was illustrating them. Remington made the comment that canoeing is his religion. He really loved canoeing, and as I said, it was something that as he gained a massive amount of weight, he still felt like he could do it. And you see a couple of photographs. There are a number of photographs, just as there are photographs of Homer, in the out-of-doors. In this case, canoeing on the St. Lawrence River. You get some sense of a couple of the islands that are in this waterway, and then him pulling up. He writes in his articles about canoeing, about portage, carrying the canoes across land, and how 2 miles is like 20 miles without a canoe, and so forth. Another illustration that comes out of his own experience, spring trout fishing in the Adirondacks, an odious comparison of weights. This was an article he did not write, but it's an accompanying illustration to what the author refers to as one of those moments which stand out like milestones in the piscatorial recollections of every angler. Who caught the biggest fish? And then the article goes on to talk about, the excitement over weighing and how the guides look on while the man is weighing. And the article suggests that this man is rather smug, and so his must weigh more. They figured it out. He does virtually the same composition a couple of years later, but changes it to a hunting scene and calls it a good day's hunting in the Adirondacks. So it serves both hunting and fishing purposes for him. And just, by way of comparison, showing a work that's, one of the really nice paintings, big paintings in the exhibition upstairs by John George Brown of the claiming the shot. It's sort of the same kind of notion of figuring out who made the shot. So there's kind of competitive aspect of it. But a group of true sportsmen, gentlemen hunters, in this case, dressed in the garb that they would wear. These men are more of the one man holding the fish on the right of center maybe is a true sportsman, but the other one looks like a real one in the sense that Remington talked about a real sportsman. And then, very unusual for Remington, a woman appears in his work. You can count on one hand how many times in the 3,000 compositions he does that a woman is included in a composition. And usually it's in a very secondary role. In this case, she is front and center. She is the angler. She is the one who is active and has agency in the catching of the fish that's taking place here. Her first, Muscalange is the title of this work, and again, a work that was served as an illustration in the journals, or in Harper's Weekly as well, where they talked about the article about this. The very first line said, "For certain she is adept." And it was all about her prowess as a fisher woman. Although it does sort of then devolve into this fantasy story of she and her husband are on their honeymoon and she's trying to impress him and so on and so forth. It kind of gets away from the initial point that was quite positive. Again, this is in the St. Lawrence. You see one of those islands in the background. It's a work that, as I say, appeared actually on the cover of an issue of Harper's Weekly. So both of these, again, we have, in the case of the image of the woman, we have the painting that he created for it. I'm not sure the one on the right exists. The one on the left is in a private collection, but then how it was circulated and how his work became widely known through the circulation of it becomes significant. And then, I'm sorry for this very bad slide on the right of a really very nice painting upstairs in the exhibition by Julian Alden Weir, The Return of the Fishing Party. I brought this in because, for a couple of reasons. One is just to reinforce a comment I think I had made in an earlier talk. Images of women fishermen are not unusual at all in the later 19th century. You find a number of them. There's this painting in the exhibition. There's also John Singer Sargent's 1912 painting of two girls fishing. But Remington's is rather different than any other I've seen. In almost all the other cases, the women are dressed in a fashion that seems like they're going to a ball rather than fishing. She looks like she's appropriately geared up, particularly with that hat, for being out of doors. These figures, it's hard to read, but there's a kind of elegance, perhaps, about them that you do find in a lot of images of women. But women, fishing magazines advertised products towards women and wrote articles about women, so they were an active part of the fishing endeavor. Not so much hunting. It's very seldom you see a scene of a female hunter. You might find a photograph, but a painting and a print is harder to come by. I also brought in this work by Weir, not only because it's in the exhibition and it's a different take on fishing, but something I'll return to is that Remington was a friend of his. And Remington is often, I think, seen as this, Western artist who is fanatic about the West, and that's all that he knows and looks at. In fact, he was friendly with a number of what were considered modern artists for the time, Impressionist painters, and artists like Weir, who was considered, he was part of a group called the Ten, which was involved with American Impressionism. Also, a movement of the later 19th century called tonalism. Weir is part of that. And that was considered a very modern movement for that particular time. So he's not somebody, just like Homer is sometimes thought of as a hermit, which he wasn't. Remington, not quite to the same extent, but he's sometimes seen as rather naive. And he was anything but. Another one of his illustrations that initially existed as a painting, In Sight of the Game, this work that appeared in Harper's New Weekly in October of 1890. In Sight of the Game, Now Shoot. And this was an article written by his friend Julian Ralph, and there are about 6 images by Remington in it. I wanted to talk about this a little bit because it's an interesting kind of circumstance how this article came about. And the article itself describes it, and that is, it starts out by talking about how Remington and Julian Ralph are in New York at their club in Manhattan, the men's club. And they step outside of the banqueting room and are having drinks. And they're both really tired. And Remington says, "I'm tired. I'm so tired. I can't go to my studio." And I mentioned last week and at previous times this idea in the later 19th century. And it was applicable to both men and women, but the idea of fatigue, of modern life, was wearing people down. Julian Ralph, as a writer, was saying, "Yeah, I can't write. I've hit a block, and I'm exhausted, and I don't know why." And this kind of exhaustion, what's called nervous exhaustion, was sort of rampant at the time. You read about it all the time. So over drinks, Remington says, in 24 hours, we could be at the Hudson Bay shooting moose. And Ralph says, "Yeah, great idea." So apparently they go immediately to the train station and leave for Montreal. And the article is about their adventure, tracking down and ultimately, in fact, shooting a moose. So this is one of the illustrations that appeared in it. I brought in, again, just by way of a sort of affinity, and in some ways also perhaps the Philip Goodwin work is almost an echo over time. It's not dated, but Goodwin wasn't born until 1881, so it had to be around the turn of the century or later. The Northwood King Calling the Moose, in which you have somewhat, obviously a similar subject, and in a very general way, a kind of similar composition, perhaps. And he may have known this illustration. This is the beginning of the article. I brought it in because it got this wonderful little vignette at the top by Remington of he and his traveling companion in their civilian clothes, although they have their gun cases or their rifle cases on their shoulders and their bags as they're heading off to the train station, presumably. And so there's this sense of a wonderful kind of movement that takes place in this article. And then when they get to Montreal, they have their pictures taken. And there's several pictures. And they're really intriguing because when you look at them closely, they're not outdoors at all. They're in a studio. And they're very much posing. And some of the poses, there's another one where Remington is lighting his pipe, and it's very contrived and stage looking. These are become, in fact, mementos of the trip. And also they get worked into some of the illustrations as well. They also, I couldn't help but, think about Roosevelt and his strenuous life. This is a photograph of Theodore Roosevelt from 1884 when he was in the Dakota Badlands. And again, going for his health and going for to be refreshed and be made a man again. And again, if you look very closely, it's a painted background behind him. And if you know the Badlands, it's not the Badlands anyway. You wouldn't find flowers like that. And so this kind of staging of manly men is something that, in fact, you see in photography at this period. And they're souvenirs, in a sense, of the trip that's going to be. They go far beyond Montreal and Quebec and further up into Canada, but they do have this taken along the way. But again, it puts Roosevelt and Remington into basically the same camp, we might say. And they were friends throughout the last decade or so of Remington's life or more. Another one of the photographs that is taken in Montreal, and as you can see, it's the figure in the center. So he, rather like Homer, he'll recycle images. He'll, bring them to bear in other situations. And as I mentioned, the weighing of the fish had its counterpart in the hunting scene, so that kind of recycling of form. One of the paintings he does a number of paintings on this trip, or they come out of this trip. He does sketches. Remington does work outdoors, but he also more often will do sketches, and then will create the paintings based on sketches. And there's a sketch for Antoine's cabin that exists. Antoine was one of their Canadian Indian guides, and they stayed at his place. The article that was written was called Antoine's Moose Yard, and a moose yard is where a herd of moose would graze, and he knew where they were, and so they stayed at his cabin, and there's this long description of it. They took that sled, which Remington said was the roughest thing he'd ever been on in his life, over a lumber road through the snow. And then you find a figure which has sometimes been identified as Remington, standing, lighting a pipe outside the cabin itself. The cabin had a very interesting chimney in that, as Remington said, it was just a big square hole cut in the roof with wood sides. But if you look really closely, you can see it's the same Hudson Bay blanket coat, which probably was something that he had acquired when he was in Canada, and it became a part of his studio equipment, part of the props that he had available. And then Remington again, it's something we don't too often see, but he did so many paintings, actually, of the North Country. Some of them, sketches that, in this case, was probably very much done on the spot. It's from a smallish sketchbook of Chippewa Bay, which is very close to where he grew up along the St. Lawrence River. Small Oaks is one of the tiny islands that is found in the St. Lawrence River, and it's where in 1887 he had gone on a camping trip there that was written about. And in a sense, he's documenting what he saw. This is a small oil painting, likely painted outdoors, finished in a studio, perhaps. But it's a wonderful kind of plein air, outdoor composition. And it has a kind of very different feel than his Western images, which, so often in Remington's Western paintings, the vastness of the landscape is emphasized and the aridness of the landscape, the dryness is focused on. Now he's in country that is green with trees and the sense of enclosure. And in fact, he sort of plays off that by having the back flap of the tent open, so you actually look right through it towards the water element. His chair set up there. And again, he would write about what he was doing on a camping trip, and the descriptions would really cohere to what you could see in the a composition such as this. He, I think I mentioned in 1899, he bought an island in the river, and he used it as he and his wife's summer home. They also had a smaller island where he had a studio, was real adjacent to it. And there was actually a ferry that they could take out to it. They could canoe. It was a fairly substantial canoe trip, but it was something that could be canoed too. This is the boathouse that was built. The island was called Inglenook. And just in the background, you can make out part of the gable of the roof, the chimney of the house that's back there. It was a substantial house. And this is where he would spend the summers. And he would paint out there. He would use this as a point of departure for travels, for camping and so forth. And he painted in a style that's in some ways very different from what we're used to seeing. It's much more in a kind of impressionistic mode. And this has always been of interest to a lot of scholars, is what he knew about Impressionism, how he knew about it, what he thought of it. We actually know what he thought of it, but like a lot of artist statements, you have to take it with a grain of salt. He one time remarked about a painting by Child Hassam. We'll look at Hassam in a minute, who was arguably the leading American Impressionist painter at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. But he remarked about a Hassam painting, quote, "I have an aunt upstate that can knit a better picture than that." And Hassam was a friend of his. And so he may have said it just to be a man with bark on, but in fact, he was very aware of Impressionism, at least American Impressionism. And a number of his friends, including Hassam Weir, were involved in Impressionism. And you find in works like this, where he, in a sense, he's experimenting. This is not a large work, which again lends a kind of credence that it may have been painted on the spot, although unlikely from a canoe, so it's probably done from sketches. But it's about a foot and a half across. So it's a small composition, but it is very loosely painted, and it has a kind of, in a sense, a kind of modernity that we often don't necessarily connect with Remington. This is another Remington. There are a number of untitled works, but it's known because of photographs that exist, for example, and also people have gone to the sites along the river, that this is from Inglenook, looking towards another smaller island called Cedar Island, where there was a shanty and there was a studio there as well. But again, at first glance, if you came upon this work cold at a garage sale, you might not at all associate it with Remington. And in fact, you might think, oh, that looks like, an Impressionist painting. And I brought in a Monet just to kind of, reinforce that. Once you look a little closer, there are obviously differences. Like most American artists who engage with Impressionism, he has a kind of substantiality to forms that French Impressionism, particularly in Monet's case, begins to dissolve and to make more, ultimately more abstract. There's still a kind of physicality to the trees and so forth in a way that's rather different from what exists in French painting. This is a child Hassam. And again, I mentioned he was friendly with Hassam. And in fact, I assume Hassam took it in good spirit because he called himself this. But he gave Hassam the nickname Muley because he was so stubborn, he said. There's a wonderful correspondence between Remington and Muley, and always talking about Hassam wasn't that much of an outdoorsman, and you could tell that Remington was trying to get him to go outdoors more often, to go camping, and so forth. This is a watercolor by Hassam from 1898, as you can see. Early summer at Lake George. Lake George is not that far, again, from where Remington was living. He had moved from upstate New York. He was living in New Rochelle, New York for a while. And then partly under the influence of Weir, who had the idea of kind of wanting to start an artist colony in Ridgefield, Connecticut. He, in fact, built in 1908 a new house in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And he had been going there quite often to Weir's farm, which was kind of just outside of Ridgefield, that did become a kind of artist center. Hassam would go there. John Twachtman, he was friends with John Twachtman. And Robert Reed, who's not so well known today, but was, I think Reed was a member of the 10. He was an American Impressionist. So he knew these people who were working, again, in a very modern way. And in fact, this is a work that it was in Remington's own collection, which isn't often talked about. And it's hard to gauge, one of the reasons it isn't talked too much about, it's hard to gauge how many works he might have had. There are only a few that can really be documented to being in his collection during his lifetime. His widow lived substantially longer, and like a lot of artist widows, really tried to bolster his reputation. And probably some of the works in the collection today came in after his death. But this certainly was one that was in his collection at the time. So again, even though he had criticized Hassam, I think he probably said it with tongue-in-cheek. And he admired his work, and I think he was very much influenced by Hassam and others. Another artist represented in the Carter collection, Willard Metcalf, was also a friend of Remington. He got on Remington's good side because he wrote a very positive letter to Remington about an exhibition Remington had and how impressed he was with him as a painter. Remington had wanted to gain recognition as a painter for years and years. And although Dash for Timber was very well received when it was shown in New York in 1889, it wasn't really till 1906 with an exhibition in New York that he was written about by critics in newspapers and journals as a real artist. And he wrote, at last, I'm a painter. he was pleased. But I brought in this Metcalf because it has just a general kind of family resemblance to Chippewa Bay, this painting by Remington, probably from around 1908. Again, a smaller sized composition. Well, not so small. It's actually 20 by 28 inches. It has a wonderful surface to it. It's an oil painting. And the way that he's managed to catch the reeds and so forth is quite nice. Somebody asked a couple of talks ago when we were looking at Aikens about the scratches on the painting. Is that person here? Yeah. I went up afterwards and looked at it, and they're reeds is what they're meant to be. They're in the marshlands. And this also has a kind of almost a frenzy of these reed-like forms, but it's really a striking composition. Metcalf was a friend, as I mentioned. He also, in his collection, had a Metcalf, a scene of the Hudson River, which in some ways is the composition is actually closer than the Carter's is to this particular painting. And then, as many of you know, in his later years, or what became his later years, again, Remington died prematurely in 1909 of complications from an appendectomy. And he was, in a sense, really hitting his stride when that happened. It was totally unforeseen. And it's really sad to read his diary because as you read it, he's a couple of days before Christmas, he's starting to write, and he does for several days, about this incredible bellyache he has, and then it ends. But his later paintings often involve what have become known as the Nocturnes, a term associated with James Whistler's paintings, and Whistler had a huge impact on later 19th century American art in terms of tonalistic compositions, and this is a good example of that. And of course he did images of the West as well in this manner, but this is a work that's sometimes regarded as a Western image. It has a precedent. It's interesting. You can argue that it relates to an earlier Western image he had done, but it also relates to an even earlier image of a Civil War scene he had painted of Union soldiers, so it would be a northern image. But at any rate, it looks like a winter in the North Country, so I'm sticking with that one. It's a wonderful composition. The slide does it no justice at all. It has this really snowy quality. And in fact, if any of you have watched Stranger Things, you know when they go in that bad place, and that it's very similar to that, although you don't feel like you're in a bad place. But it's also a very kind of oral composition. It's almost like you can hear that kind of quietness when it's snowy. It's really quite remarkable. It's darker, it's more contrasty than you see here. And it's a substantially sized painting. It's about 51 inches across, so it's a big composition. And that wonderful light, the warmth of the home in the background once he unhitches the team, puts them to stable and so forth. And again, Hassam comes back in. Hassam did a number of scenes that involve this tonalist aspect. This is an earlier work of his showing a scene in Brooklyn related to the Brooklyn Bridge, actually. But again, it's something clearly a kind of work that Remington would have known. And then also this is a real discovery for me to see this work, was a work by Anna Richard Brewster, who is not well known like a lot of later 19th and earlier 20th century female artists. But recently there have been a couple of catalogs written about her in exhibitions. Like a lot of female artists in the history of art, she was the daughter of an artist. Her father was William Tross Richards, whose work is one of his works is in the collection here. But this is a really very nice winter landscape from 1906 that was in Remington's collection, which is really quite extraordinary because, again, women don't figure very prominently in his art world. And for him to have, among the few paintings we know that he had, to have this work is I think, quite something and very, very intriguing to me. This is also, he does a series of larger paintings, again, 4 feet to 5 feet, or 4.5 feet in width, that take on this very tonalistic, atmospheric quality. And this is also a work that, when you stand in front of it, you sort of put your arms around to warm up. It's a very cool painting, this misty, foggy environment where you can just imagine this boat kind of emerging out of the fog, and these are people that are breaking up the ice as spring. This is probably in late May, has finally arrived in the North Country, and they're breaking up the ice of the river, and this kind of monumental prow of the boat, and these rather heroic figures emerging out of this very moody and atmospheric, I think, composition. Really quite beautiful, too. And then 2 final works just to balance off the north and the west, we might say. The Howl of the Weather, a very dynamic painting by Remington, showing indigenous people. There's actually, in the center of the boat is a woman with a child. And they're, this is clearly the St. Lawrence area. They're in that gap of the wind tunnel, the weather howling, the waves kicking up and so forth, and trying to make their way across. And I brought in this work, which is in the Sid Richardson collection, in part because it makes a kind of nice counterpart to it. And in a way, one of the arguments I would make would be that the paintings, many of the paintings he's doing of the North Country are as intriguing, as good as paintings of the West, but they haven't received the sort of attention that images like this and images that the Carter has have. But you have similar, certainly in these 2 images, a similar kind of dynamism and kind of elemental forces, particularly in the one above, humans interacting with nature and so forth. This situation will be somewhat rectified, I'm happy to say. The Sid Richardson Museum is organizing an exhibition of Remington's North Country work, which will be opening, I think, in the fall of 2018. So we'll have a chance to see some of these works, and then some of the others that not often seen. So it'll be a real treat.